after the summer retreat.
I know.
Okay, I'd like to call to order the Governance and Priorities Committee meeting for Monday, August 26th. Good afternoon, welcome to the August 26th Governance Priorities. I'd like to recognize that we're on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. Our clerk today is Ms. Skye Snellgrove. If during the meeting any member of the gallery has a question regarding an agenda item, please write down your name and the agenda item on the question period sign-up sheet. And at the start of the question period, I'll call those who have signed up to the podium to address council. Item 2, introduction of late items. I'd like to add Kim Smythe, CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, to the agenda. Do we need a motion to do this? No. So if I could get a motion for the adoption of the agenda as amended. Mayor Crowe, seconded by Councilor Martin. All in favor? Carried. And a motion for the adoption of the minutes of the Governance and Priorities Committee of Monday, July 29th. Councilor Bonner, seconded by Councilor Brown. All in favor? Carried. So, number 5, reports, economic health. And I believe Mr. Corson will be introducing this.
Mr. Rudolph wants to go. Great, so, yes? Okay. So, thanks, Your Worship. So I just want to provide you with a brief overview before Mr. Nielsen takes you through his report and outlines his recommendations. But just want to give you a little background on the economic development file. I think most of you are familiar with where we've been. So the economic development function has been in-house since the closure of NEDC in late 2016, early 2017. We have one dedicated staff member, Ms. Manhouse, who's our EDO, and she's supported through an admin assistant on my team, as well as myself. In late January this year, on January 28th, we had Dale Wielden and Colleen Bond from the Economic Development Association of BC. They came and did a half day with you on economic development, what it is, and various functions that can be incorporated, the various aspects of economic development. And then on the 29th of April, we came back to council with terms of reference to actually look for a consultant to help us decide what the economic development service model could look like. And through that, we hired Mr. Nielsen, who got to work right away, very quickly, and started interviewing stakeholders in May and June. We had a workshop with various stakeholders in June. We had an open house. We came back to you at the end of July with the interim report, and we had a good discussion at this table around what the various service model options are and how it could be delivered. Based on the feedback we received at that meeting and feedback we received from various stakeholders, Mr. Nielsen has a report for you, and he'll talk to you about his recommendations. In the report itself, we have 3 options for you, which are all, I'd suggest, focus around some of the key discussion we had at that meeting, which was around the economic development service, the economic development strategy, and kind of the timing of it too. I think we've tried to come up with something that will phase the city's investment in economic development over time, but will get us started quickly on this and engage the community. So I will let Mr. Wilson go from here.
Excuse me, Chair, before we move on to the next presentation, we do have a delegation.
Yes, I was noticing that. Should they come before?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay. So I think maybe if it's possible, we'll have the delegation from the chamber to fill this week. What is it?
You should be after.
Yeah, maybe we'll do it after. Yeah.
Prepare my notes for speaking to Mr. Nielsen.
Good. Great, yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. It's very nice to be back here. I was here, as Mr. Corson mentioned, about a month ago to talk with you about the interim report and to participate in the discussion the committee had. And as Mr. Corson mentioned, I'm now here to present the final report, which is very similar to the interim report, although with a few major kind of key changes towards the end. So I'll speak to those and outline the recommendations in the document. Do we have, I'm sorry, do we have a clicker? I can-
It's just.
Right there. Am I looking at it? Okay, there we are. Thank you very much. Okay. There we go. Let me just, very briefly, I just have a few slides, much shorter than my last presentation last month, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things I'd like to talk about. Just a brief overview again of the interim report, not spending much time at all on it, just to kind of refresh our memories, as it were. Talk a little bit about the review that we had here at committee a month ago. As Mr. Corson mentioned, it was a good discussion. I identified a couple of different points that came out of that discussion, so I'll just review those very briefly to kind of demonstrate how they then work themselves into the recommendations. Presenting those recommendations then for the committee to consider, and then finally, of course, any discussion that the committee wishes to have, and any questions I can answer, I'm more than happy to do so. The interim report, as Mr. Corson mentioned, the city announced some time ago its intention to enhance its economic development function. And it then set out to create some terms of reference, as was mentioned, and to put forward a study that looked at a new function and looked at two specific elements in that. One was kind of the scope of services. So what, in other words, would the city's new function do specifically? And then second was the preferred service model. And the preferred service model was really kind of the key bit in there, but the service scope was also important because it plays into the service model a little bit. The assignment emphasized the importance of consultation. So my brief really kind of highlighted, if you will, or the need to go out and meet with representatives of the different economic development agencies or agencies that play a different a specific role in the city's economic development. So I met with about 20 different folks representing groups in the nonprofit sector, the private sector, and the public sector, and presented all that information last day to you when I met with you a month ago. When we look at the contents of the interim report, of course, and these contents follow through now to our final version, we started with our introduction, just laying out what it is we were assigned to do in the study. Look then at the economic development in Nanaimo, that is the function, how the function has evolved over time and what the function does today. We also, though, looked at all of the different things, all of the specific services that the other agencies in town also provide in kind of the economic development landscape, if you will. So those services plus what the city does create that broader landscape of economic development in the city. From there, then, we were able to identify a proposed and an initial scope of services for the city's new function. Now, that scope of services we emphasized last time really kind of set out what the city could do in its new function. It was silent, however, though, on the issue of kind of how the city would deliver those services or who would deliver those services. So we really kind of focused on what the city would provide, and then we get into the more the delivery of that service or that function. And that's where we look at the service model. As Mr. Corson mentioned, we looked at 5 different options, each of which was kind of laid out in a scenario in the interim report and in the final report. Those options included the 3 basic ones, kind of an in-house function like we have now, a city-owned corporation or agency like we had under the NEDC, but and like other places have as well. And then the third was a contract organization, where which the city has in place right now, for example, with the Tours of Vancouver Island. Those were the 3 basic ones. We then also looked at 2 hybrid ones. One which married the city's in-house function with a city-owned agency, an external agency, and the second which looked at which brought together the city's in-house function with an independent contract organization on an outside of the city. Those were assessed and looked at those were assessed then in the model. And we came out and we had a good discussion around that, and that then kind of brought us to where we are today, looking at now the final report where we get to some of the recommendations. I will just mention again fairly briefly that when we looked at our review, when we had our discussion, a number of points emerged from committee members around the table, and there was some good consensus on some of those points and not so much consensus on other points. I'll just review for our recollection kind of what those were. So the first point was, I think, the hybrid approach. There seemed to be a consensus around the table that there was a preference for some kind of hybrid approach. That is an approach that has both city in-house services provided under the function, but then also some services assigned to an external agency. The question, I think, that remained unresolved by the end is what should the relationship be between that external agency and the city? Should it be owned by the city, or should it be a separate independent organization that the city would contract the assignment, the delivery of certain services to? Inclusive governance. Another point that came up in our discussion and that was emphasized was this notion that we wanted some kind of, in our outside entity, we wanted to make sure that there was the ability to bring into the governance of the function representatives and stakeholders from other bodies, to build that support for that function going forward. So that notion then of inclusivity in governance and decision making. And really on the external agency, that would be focused on the independent or the autonomous board of directors that the external agency would be governed by. We talked a little bit about multi-sector funding, and there was interest in the idea, and I think consensus support around the idea of having our model on a go-forward basis have funding not only from the city, but also funding from other agencies that have a stake in the economic development of the community. So this was kind of the point at which we were talking about putting your money where your mouth is almost, kind of everybody kind of buying and getting some skin in the game. However, with the city kind of providing the bulk of the funding, particularly for the core functioning of the function. We had a robust discussion around the economic development strategy, and it's in particular kind of when it should occur, the chicken and the egg idea. There was, I think, consensus around the idea that we needed an economic development strategy going forward. The issue was one of more, when should it occur? Should it occur before we embrace a certain service model, or should it occur kind of under a new service model once that's in place? We talked about the financial plan, the timing around that financial plan, and how time is kind of the essence with respect to this study and this initiative, and how the city has undertaken not only to invest additional resources into the function, but to do so at some level for 2020. We also identified the idea of an investment fund. You'll recall I mentioned that as a possible service, possible part of the function that could exist on a go-forward basis. The idea that I made reference to certain funds in other cities, and also here in the city of Nanaimo with the Vancouver Island University, the idea of having some kind of fund of public monies that could make investments into different initiatives. And finally, we talked about, I was asked to, if I could provide some feedback that I got from interviewees. In other words, what did the people I interviewed, what do they think about the model going forward? And you'll recall that I mentioned at that point that there was consensus among those whom I interviewed for some kind of hybrid approach. And like some of the discussion earlier around that day around the committee table, there was some question as to whether that hybrid approach should include a city-owned external agency or an independent contract agency.
Mr. Nelson?
Yes.
Sorry, I missed your, but I read your report, but I just had a question. When you're referring to the investment plan, obviously we as a city can't do that under the charter. So would that be only for the hybrid approach, where it would be another group that would do the investment fund?
That's right. So it would be, what we do have in some cities, for example, we have a fund that is developed but kind of under a separate corporation. So the local government act, for example, the community charter gives the city the ability to create a separate corporation. That corporation would then, with its own governance model, so you're quite right, it wouldn't be the city itself.
Okay, thank you. I just need clarification, so appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, this brings us now forward to the final report, really, and the items I just reviewed from on the board here that were kind of raised and discussed at our last meeting are also in the report, but they kind of come forward now to the recommendations. What we've tried to do in the recommendations is hit on two key points that stood out from the discussion we had last day. The first is related to the strategy, and not so much do we need a strategy, but when should the strategy occur relative to the establishment of a service model. The second point is what exactly should that hybrid service model look like? Should it be the city internal services married to an external agency owned primarily or wholly by the city, or should it be a model that has some city internal services married to an independent organization that the city contracts to provide certain services or to deliver certain services? Those kind of two key points we tried to kind of identify and weave into the recommendations and provide some advice on. So what we've come up with, first of all, is recommendations on the scope of services. I won't spend much time on this because we've already kind of covered the scope of services last day. They're in the document. They're in recommendation 5.1 or figure 5.1, and those really kind of carry forward from the last document. The only exception there is that I've suggested that the city consider putting aside for the time being the issue of the service of a possibility of creating an investment fund to mitigate and focus on some of the other things. So we talk about strategy, data analysis and reporting, navigating city hall, service contract management, policy input, coordination of efforts, business attraction. All those services, again, we talked about at some length last day and they're in the report. We then looked at the service delivery model. And again, the key question was, where do we put the strategy and where do we put the, and how do we kind of structure the external agency? So, the recommendations kind of ask council or proposed to council or to the committee initially that the city endorse an in-house city-owned agency. So dealing then with one of those two issues we talked about. So what I've recommended is that the external agency be owned wholly or primarily by the city. The recommendations also then talk about dividing the scope of services in the hybrid model between the city internal function and the city external agency. The city also, or importantly, the recommendations also then talk about creating, striking, and this came from the presentation that was given by the MIBI president, Mr. Moss, last day, where he talked about striking some kind of panel. I thought that made a lot of sense, and so what we've suggested here is identifying or creating an Nanaimo Prosperity Steering Committee to do a couple of different things. The first is to oversee, to guide, to in essence kind of take responsibility for the development of this economic development strategy. And then the second is to flesh out, if you will, what the new external city-owned agency would look like. And I've arbitrarily kind of attached the name the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency to that. You'll note that it's careful not to put in the word corporation. So we've got the new committee then is recommended would do two things, just to summarize. It would be, first of all, to undertake the development of that strategy, and then at the same time, or kind of at the end of that strategy, start to flesh out what the agency owned by the city as part of this hybrid model would look like. Mr. Chair, that's the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Excellent, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Nielsen? Councilor Bonner, and Thorpe, and Turley.
Thank you, Chair. And to Mr. Nielsen, thanks, really love the report. Do you have any recommendations in terms of the city-owned agency and how we can protect it in the future from changes in political venues, political ideas, I guess?
Well, that's a very good question, and I guess there are two answers to that question, if I may. The first is, I think, to have in place a very strong governance structure, and to have married to that structure some education for the key parties that are going to be involved. The key parties in this case are going to be City Council itself, city senior staff, and the board of directors for the new agency. So those parties need to be very clear on kind of who's doing what and what the responsibilities are there. At the end of the day, that's kind of the first answer. At the end of the day, as long as the city kind of owns that agency, but even under a contract model, as long as the city is paying the bill, the city, if it wished, could muck about. I'll put it that way, could make life difficult for that agency. So at the end of the day, it does require council, senior staff, the community to really take joint ownership over this and make it work. I don't think there's a structure out there that we could kind of point to and say this is bulletproof in terms of any future concerns with respect to involvement or interference and so forth. But I think that right at the end of the document, on the very last page, in fact, just before the appendices, I've laid out some proposed parameters that the steering committee may want to consider kind of structuring and fleshing out that agency. And in there, it talks about the importance of governance, it talks about board education, it talks about a lot of other things that are going to be really critical to put in place. So I hope that answers that.
Councilor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Nielsen. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was not here for the July presentation, but I did read the interim report, and of course I've read your final report. Personally, I'm excited about the hybrid model. I've seen in-house, I've seen external, and I think both can work, but I think working with a little bit of both would be even more effective. My two questions, Mr. Nielsen, are these. First of all, with the external agency, city-owned agency, as you refer to it, I also saw the word autonomous. And I think you've already alluded to the challenge of the degree of control or governance that council would have over an autonomous agency. So I think that's something that we'll still need to flesh out, and maybe you can comment on that further. And secondly, I wasn't too clear on the role of the steering committee per se, compared to the actual role of the external agency. Would the steering committee exist to establish the parameters of the external agency and then cease to exist? Or would there still be a steering committee overseeing the external agency? Can you help me with those?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Excellent questions. Let me start with the second, if I may. You're absolutely right on the first point you made, and that is that the steering committee is designed to be a select committee of council. So select committees typically are time limited. So that would be created as a select committee that would exist solely for the purposes of the structure of the agency, solely to kind of lay out the shape of the agency. Once the agency were formed, then the steering committee would cease to exist.
Okay, thank you.
And then with respect to the first question on autonomy, you're quite right. It is difficult to as we just mentioned in the previous discussion, it's difficult to create that firewall, as it were. And to some degree, I don't think we want to create that firewall, because in places where these external agencies work well, these city-owned external agencies well, there's a very robust and close exchange between the city and the agency's board of directors. And that's something that is very important to establish, because the city is, as a number of the interviewees mentioned in some of my discussions with them, the city is kind of where things happen. The city hall, that is, where things happen. So it's very important for that external agency to have close connections to the city. Those connections are created and fostered in part by the makeup of the board, but also in other ways too. So when we look at kind of the autonomy of that body, there's, first of all, a bit of a spectrum, I think. Autonomy is kind of here, and then a little bit further is independence. This would not be an independent body because it would be owned by the city, and ultimately council would be responsible for that agency. What we would want to have in place, though, very clearly, I think, is the expectation written into and the responsibility written into the shareholders agreement and the charter for the agency, that city council's role is to appoint the board of directors, and city council has the authority to remove the board of directors. On a day-to-day basis, city council doesn't have authority or responsibility over what the agency does. Members, if there is a city council representative on the board of directors, that's fine too, but that doesn't mean the council then has the right or the expectation to kind of get involved in a big way. So that autonomy, I think, with respect, you asked if I could give a recommendation on that. I think the key recommendation would be to limit and be very clear on the authority of council with respect to the running the operations of the agency.
Thank you, and I'll say personally, those are the answers I was hoping for, so thank you very much.
Excellent.
Councilor Turley.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me, Mr. Nielsen. The question I have is more to do with funding flow and how it's going to work. I understand, I believe, the in-house being part of a line item in the budget. So, but the part I'm having trouble with figuring out is the city-owned agency, I assume, would have a budgetary amount set forth. And I'm guessing that it would be up to them to determine if they wanted to hire expertise from XYZ Corporation to develop XYZ economic development. Is that,
Sure. Thank you.
How it works? Or is that...
Thank you very much. The short answer is yes, and I think that the key bit there to remember, however, is that what I've suggested is that, and ultimately the steering committee is going to chime in on this, is that what's important from a funding perspective, first and foremost, is stability. Is longevity. So we can't have an agency that is spending half of its time looking for funding to keep the lights on. It's not going to do what it is you need it to do in that case. And so what I've suggested is that the city undertake to commit kind of the core funding. That is the funding that is required to keep the staff employed, to kind of keep the building open, and all those kinds of things to keep things going. The city could choose to invest in certain initiatives that the agency would take on, but I think also in the spirit of others kind of putting skin in the game, I think that it would be very helpful, and this is a practice in other places as well, where other private, nonprofit, public agencies invest in specific initiatives, invest in parts of the agency's work that kind of are over and above the core function of the agency. So initiatives that would be undertaken by the agency then, they could be funded using other sources other than the city or in addition to the city.
Councillor Armstrong.
Just to follow up on Councillor Thorpe's, I'm still concerned about oversight of this. You talk about, you have your steering committee, which will then form the basis for the agency, I guess, whatever you're calling it. Could you not keep that steering committee though as your oversight first, and then that's the first person you go to, instead of like what happened previously where they pick and choose different councillors to go to? So you have your oversight committee that could still remain, or the steering committee, which could change to whatever, as an oversight, and then council being the final? Because otherwise, you could have things coming to council continually, or you could have them cherry picking which councillor they want to talk to, which we've seen this.
Thank you very much. I think that the short answer again is yes, you could have that in place. I think council would have, it's council's prerogative to put in place whatever structure it wanted in order to kind of provide that oversight. The key bit I think to kind of emphasize is that we want to make sure, is that city council at the end of the day is legally responsible for and accountable for that entity that it owns. And so you want to make sure there's sufficient accountability back to city council. That can occur different ways. So oversight occurs in different ways. We have our quarterly reports, we can have our shareholders agreement, we can have all those different things. The extent, I wouldn't anticipate that there would have to be by law, there would have to be an annual shareholders meeting. So there would at least be one opportunity for council, one need for council to be involved in that, and that's something that you couldn't, it may be difficult to delegate to a steering committee, but on a more ongoing basis, you could have a steering committee in place for sure. One thing, I suspect, I mean, one could argue that if council is predisposed to getting involved, I'm not sure a steering committee would stop them from doing that. So, but on the other hand, if council decides that it wants much more hands off than it would have otherwise, then a steering committee may be a perfect solution.
Mayor Krog.
Following up on what Councillor Armstrong had to say, it strikes me that we'll want it to be autonomous when it's successful and independent when it's a failure. In terms of how that structure goes, I appreciate what Councillor Armstrong's getting at, but I think if it's to be successful, and I'm just curious to know if you have other cities where the model has been employed, I don't see us being involved in council or a steering committee unless it's very clearly laid out. It seems to me the CAO, hate to add to the burdens down at the end of the table here, but it seems to me that that's where I would expect reports to go on a regular basis, and that we would largely, much like we hopefully behave with respect to staff who work for the city generally, that we would lay the tracks, but we don't play with the trains too much. You know, we're expecting this, I'll call it a entity to be nimble and to respond in a way that politicians often can't or don't or are reluctant to or want to spend too much time in process. And so I think the maintenance possibly of the steering committee is a bit risky, although I appreciate the necessity at the inception. So I'm just curious, do you have any examples where that might respond to the concerns that have been raised?
Very good question. None come to mind I'm just trying to think, are there any examples where we have a steering committee in place? There are some examples, I suppose, I can't quite put my finger on it at this moment, where you would have kind of a committee of council or something kind of playing that role. And so there'd be a kind of a somewhat like a steering committee, but you'd still be a committee of council. Vancouver, for example. So, and you could, of course, as a committee of council, you could appoint others to that as well if you wanted to kind of involve some others in that oversight. But I think you're quite right, Mayor. I think that it is, when it's working as it should work, council and individual councils are going to be very hands-off, are just not going to be involved much. And remember that there is going to be city representation on the board of directors. The number and who is on there, that's something for the steering committee to figure out. I've chimed in on that, and we had a good discussion about that last time. And I think that you mentioned also, you referred to the CAO. I personally think that in an effort, particularly in the early days, to kind of give this function the profile and give the agency the profile it deserves, and to really kind of help get Nanaimo back in the game, as it were, on economic development, it would be very helpful to have the kind of a strong relationship directly to the city manager's government, or the city manager's office, excuse me. But I think you're quite right about the role of council in that respect being very hands-on.
Councilor Bonner?
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Senator. In your recommendations, you recommend that the steering committee is responsible for setting up the strategy and then building the agency. Have you considered the possibility that there's a possibility that the steering committee may have a preconceived idea of what the agency is going to look like, and therefore would tailor the strategy to fit that? And did you ever consider a steering committee to set up the strategy, which I'm hoping is very encompassing, and then at that point saying, okay, now that we have a strategy, let's get a whole bunch of new people in here and we'll build an agency based on that?
Thank you very much. I hadn't thought about that, but that is a very good idea. That's a very workable idea, I think. I think that it's with respect to you touched a moment ago on kind of that point that we spent some time on last day, which is that relationship between the strategy and the structure. And the suggestion that the strategy will determine the structure, I'm not sure I don't agree with personally. I know others hold that view. So I think that actually, I don't think we would, I think if the steering committee had preconceived ideas on what the agency should look like, I'm not sure that would take away from the value of or impair at all the kind of the strategy. But if that was a concern, you could certainly kind of follow the direction that you set out there and having two different bodies to do that.
Councilor Cummings?
Thank you. I just want to echo that concern, and following on Councillor Armstrong's previous comment that members of the committee will also likely be members of the agency, or there's a lot of crossover there. So I do want to express some concern, I guess. I don't think the strategy, I think we're on the right track, but I do worry a bit that we're going to be replicating what certain individuals think we should be doing rather than putting all the ideas on the table and fleshing it out that way. So I would definitely support a move towards Councillor Bonner's recommendation idea that we separate them.
If I may just add to that, Mr. Chair, I think that's a very good point. I think that probably the most important task for council at that stage is going to be in selecting members of the steering committee, whether there's one committee or two. So I think the concern that is going to be a body full of like-minded people can be addressed, I think, through kind of the membership of that, and that's going to be council's prerogative to determine that.
More questions? Councilor Brown?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Just a quick question, I hope. Is there, in your experience in the province and maybe elsewhere, just touching on that, I think there's probably, due to history in Nanaimo, a overemphasis, and I think it's justified also with having that concern around trying to separate the body too far from council. Sometimes I'm wondering though if it's actually, and it's actually something Councillor Gesselbrock said to me, if the opposite would achieve that in making sure that there's close ties with council so you don't have alienation. And so you can sort of have them, on one end very inclusive, including council, and on the other end no council involvement. Is there a particular, is there an element of that has shown to be successful over time, or is it just sort of everywhere it's got something different and it just happens to work?
That's a very good question. I think, Mr. Chair, if I may, where the model works best is when the different parties, the different players understand their roles and responsibilities. So the model works well when council understands the need to respect the autonomy of the board of directors of the agency, and the board of directors of the agency understands the relationship it has with council and with senior staff. Where it fails is when we get, and we talked about this concern as well, is when we get council kind of involving itself too much in the runnings of the agency. I think that where it does work as well, you have that autonomy, but you also have that very strong connection with the city. If you look at some of the economic development strategies that are out there in communities that have either hybrid or a purely external agency model that is owned by the city, you will have, you will see there that there's a tremendous connection between the agency and City Hall itself, both at the political and at the staff level, but kind of at the overall City Hall level. So that agency, those relationships are so important to ensure, and maybe this gets to your point, that there's enough closeness to allow the agency to function at its best, so that you don't kind of fall into the temptation or to the view that you need to have complete independence. I think I will mention as well that in my interviews, there were a number of different views expressed with respect to whether the agency should be owned wholly or partially by the city or completely independent. On the whole, though, I was very convinced by the comments that the majority of people gave to me, which was, look, we want autonomy, but we don't think it's a good idea to be completely independent from the city because that link is so important.
Thank you. Councilor Turley.
Yes, thank you, Chair. One other question I have, I know that the city cannot accept funding from other sources, however, is the agency able to?
Yes.
Any more questions? Councilor Thorpe.
If I may, Chair, thank you very much. Not a question, but I would like to make a short comment to follow up on something the mayor said earlier relating to the last question also, I believe, or the one before. And it seems to me that whatever relationship council has with what we're going to set up in terms of an external agency is very similar to our relationship with our working staff. And we have a duty of oversight, a responsibility to monitor, but we also have to have a large degree of trust. And I see the steering committee in this case being very important in putting together a strong and competent external agency, and then stepping away and letting them do their job, at the same time making sure that we have regular and fulsome reporting out so that we can monitor on a regular basis, but not getting in the way from day to day. So to me, that's very important, and I think it's similar to the way we hopefully treat our operational staff. Thank you.
More questions? One more question, and we'll call
A little one, if I may.
Mr. Smythe up to present.
Yeah. In your research, have you come across any of these type of agencies that own and develop land?
Yes, there are some, but typically, where there is a body that is going to be kind of a land developer, they'll create a separate body for that. Because that is that's almost an execution or an implementation of a strategy that the agency would develop, or a tackle, or a way for a direction the agency would develop. So Surrey, for example, had one in place where it had the Development Corporation, Surrey Development Corporation, which would do things like that. Vancouver, I think, has a land corporation in place, those kinds of things. So they do exist, but they tend to be kind of taken out of the Economic Development Agency and used more as a kind of operational body to implement a specific course of action that the Development Agency has identified.
Thanks. Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nielsen. So I think maybe we'll call up Mr. Smythe to present, and then after that we'll take questions and have a bit more discussion where we can ask questions again to Mr. Nielsen and the staff and that before we move on.
Thank you, Chair. Well, the Nanaimo Chamber is very pleased that the final Nielsen report reflects the remarks and recommendations made by some of us at the presentation of the preliminary report as it pertained to ongoing and future consultation with community economic development stakeholders. So I'm glad we got the order of this sorted out, because some of your questions that came up, I think I can also add some commentary to that. I think in terms of future consultation that the agency, Prosperity Agency, would want to have continuing and ongoing communication and direction from economic development stakeholders in this community. So whether it's called a steering committee or something, a looser definition of what that might be, I foresee that we will want to continue the conversation going forward. As we've stressed before here, and Mr. Moss as well as myself, is that economic development is a team sport. It is not a go-it-alone game. So those are things that we can flesh out a little bit more in the future. And while the Chamber wishes for a rapid conclusion of the studies, planning, and research in order to initiate actions of very favorable and positive side to continuing with stakeholder input, as I stated last time I was at this podium. Further, the development of a steering committee made up of these stakeholders ensures that varied perspectives and experience can be shared to drive the process forward. We've spoken about the success of this approach based on past experiences with EDG, the Economic Development Group. I anticipate this experience will lead to greater success as long as we ensure that the selection of those steering committee members is as broad and inclusive as possible, balanced by the need to keep the size limited so the pace of progress does not get slowed down under its own weight. I wish to thank Alan for his incisive, thorough, and very clear report. I'm especially appreciative of his definitions and statements in the reports section around economic development. What is it? We started this conversation with many councillors reaching out to the Chamber of Commerce saying, what is economic development? Where does it start? Where does it end? What's included in that? So to have this definition that we can all land on at once gives us a great starting point to go forward. It's quite clear that we need that single common definition, one that's easily understood. The report's summary recommendations in section 5 are also very helpful by being very focused. Thank you, Alan. So our final words of encouragement now are, let's get going and work towards a strategic plan and a working model to start delivering our compelling story to business and industry elsewhere and pursue the prosperity that Nanaimoites deserve. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Smythe? Thank
I
you.
keep these purposely short so that people don't get...
Thank you. So we'll open the floor to some discussion. If there's any more questions. Councilor Armstrong.
Sorry, I missed the 29th meeting, but I'm assuming for the startup, we'd be looking at taxation, or is that correct? Does anybody know?
Yeah. Councilor Martin.
I'm just curious, and maybe this comes later in the process, but this time we only have one staff member in our economic development department. So I'm not sure who to direct this to, but would I assume that there would be more staffing for the economic development?
I think I might answer that. So just on process moving forward, just to sort that out, so there's a bunch of stuff here. One is, this report, should council or committee recommend it, goes to the September 9th council meeting. So that's my understanding, that is what we would be taking, this goes to, and council will make its decision on this moving forward piece at that time, so that's September 9th. Secondly, in conjunction with this process is a business plan that's being prepared, which will outline a business case for additional resourcing inside the City Hall side of this, which will be part of the business planning process, which will be presented to you later in the fall. So that's being prepared by Mr. Corson. And so we'll have a companion set of information about additional resources that could be applied to get us going, including the funding for a strategic plan exercise, which would have to therefore take place starting early in the new year. So we would want to gear ourselves up with the anticipation for that exercise. Meantime, we need to also be bringing back to you a package for this steering committee or task force or whatever we're calling it, to get that going without delay, so that once we're all through all this process, they will have be able to hit the ground running, I'm assuming, January. Earlier, but with the funding for the strategic plan, it would have to be attached to the budget. So I guess that's sort of the sequence of events that are, so there's a lot of pieces that are coming forward. But back to your question, there's got to be, we have a very limited budget in there at this time. We'll come back to you with a report in the not too distant future on next steps, and that's generally the way it.
Thank you.
Okay. I have a quick question for Mr. Nielsen and then Councilor Bonner, Councilor Hemmons, and also remind that there was a recommendation before by staff that we can potentially move it. Question that I have is just with the steering committee, the composition of that, just sort of in your thought process, you foresee it roughly being composed of
I think as Mr. Smythe kind of suggested, it would be helpful, in my view, to have a representative of council perhaps on there, or the city, at least senior management, but have largely comprised of leaders of various agencies in the city, so stakeholders, if you will, in the community.
Great. Mr. Bonner?
With your indulgence, Chair, I would like to move a motion that the Governance and Priorities Committee recommend that Council endorse the recommendations set out in the Economic Development Service Model final report, specifically items 1 through 7.
Second.
Seconded by Councillor Armstrong. Did you want to speak to this, Councillor Bonner?
Well, I do have a question on timing, if I may. I understand where we would be heading at with the money in the budget for the strategy plan. If we kind of go with what was being spent last time, that's the better part of a 1% tax increase. Would we be looking at that at the next year's budget, or is that going to be wrapped in, considering we don't know what it's going to look like particularly yet? The agency.
Through Madam Chair and Councillor Bonner, the 1% that you're referring to also included the tourism function. So this is being carved out of this exercise at this time. So tourism is very fully covered on the way we have this set up between that and the MRDT allocation is very self-sufficient, I think. So this is not a 1%. This would be, I feel, if you're looking at the number, something less than half of that probably, or in that right around 50% of what it was before, if you're looking at a number. Mind you, so that puts us in the 400,000 to 600,000 range, all in the function. If we're emulating what we were allocating before, it's my expectation. If we do more or less, then really becomes a budget conversation about how much we're putting into the in-house pie and how much we're setting aside for future outside.
And my question on that is, we're not really going to know how much we're going to pie out until such time as the strategy is done.
That's correct, but we have to anticipate some roll-up of, we're expecting to give you a presentation on enhanced in-house moving into next year, or else we are delaying it a whole lot.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what, we need to have the sufficient flexibility to get going. So the momentum needs to be there with this exercise, with this task force, our steering committee, and our budget process, and we'll be really in a robust process next year, in addition to which hopefully we're actually doing some economic development in terms of more than the business retention and expansion, but continuing on in some fashion with the attraction.
Thanks. Councillor Hemmons, and then Councillor Turley, and then...
Thank you, through you to Mr. Rudolph. Just clarifying on Councillor Bonner's point, so we're going to have a business case come to us to look at an enhancement of the in-house function,
Yes.
as well as the development of the steering committee that will direct the
Yes.
strategy.
Yes.
Now, the actual agency, are we putting aside funds for that this year?
Well, we have to think of that and conceptualize what that might be, and so that information, we'll have to give you some information around that and determine where we're going, but I was anticipating that there may end up being a second year of this exercise, so that the full funding of this entire function, in-house and externally, is probably not likely until after the strategic plan is completed, which will be next year. So I think that that's really a full funding envelope for 2021.
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Chair. So this question may be premature, but I think it needs to be thought about, and they already have been thought about. Now it's the issue of administration of the two different facilities. Is it going to be done, each group has their own administration, or would it be done all in-house, or just what would be the
Through
solution?
the chair to Councillor Turley, the question, I've raised this conversation again. It would not make a lot of sense to have duplicity. It would be inefficient, so I would think, as a matter of sorting this out, is what is the background support for this in the HR, IT, administration, and that type of thing. So that'll have to be costed out to some extent. What's the value of that in terms of supporting the entity? So my answer is, I think, my recommendation initially, without having any analysis, is that that would be an in-house service that's provided, unless the steering committee feels otherwise.
Mayor Crowe.
Speaking of the motion, staff presented us with three options, and obviously the first one has been moved, and advantages and disadvantages pointed out. Firstly, I want to thank Mr. Nielsen, and I want to thank staff for the report, which provided the three potential options. One thing I do want to emphasize, though, is that as much as I appreciate what Mr. Rudolph has had to say, I am urging that we move as quickly as we can, both in terms of developing a strategy, the appointment committees, steering committee, etc. And I say that not because I'm a negative person by nature, but you know, we are riding a wave in this community right now, and businesses are all telling us the same thing. We have a shortage of people who are competent or able, trained staff. The unemployment rate is low. We're building housing at incredible rates. The statistics we've heard from Mr. Lindsay, you know, 216 million last year, 300 in the whole year, 306 million in permits issued this year. Things still look pretty good for a while. And the point of the whole economic development approach, in my view, is it's not to enhance the prosperity that we enjoy particularly. It is to prepare us and ensure that when whatever dips come, as they inevitably do, that we are in a better position than other communities to ensure that our citizens have a level of prosperity that they might not otherwise enjoy during the bottom of that dip. And so I don't have any crystal balls, but I'm hopeful that when that comes, that we will have been in a position to have that strategy there, so that whatever investment dollars are out there will want to come here, and those businesses that are here already and that we wish to enhance will in fact understand that there is a community and a city behind them to ensure that they survive through whatever that dip may look like when it comes. So I'm strongly supportive of this and the work that's been done, and obviously I'm going to support this motion here and at council, it gets to council. But I do urge that we don't spend too much time talking, because I think it's pretty clear how the path has been laid out. I would rather us move and be in a position ahead of other communities, because other communities have had their strategies in place for a while. They have their economic development models in place. We blew ours up a little while ago, and we have, notwithstanding its absence, done very well just because of the economic times in which we live. I want us to be prepared for when things aren't so sweet and cheery and rosy. But pardon the negative nature of my worries, but it is my nature to think about the bad times as well as the good times and let them roll. But I'd like to ensure that when they roll, it's a little sweeter. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, not to disagree with the mayor, that would be bad.
It's all right.
Just to acknowledge that we do not have money in budget this year for this, so we're either drawing on surplus or something, or I'm anticipating having to add baseline budgeting information into budget for next year. So there are mechanisms to advance the exercise for the strategic plan and type of thing in advance of this, for sure. There's no question. But just be cautioned about the budget process will be as challenging as you can imagine in terms of balancing all the competing interests and so forth moving forward. So we're trying to pace ourselves through this fiscally so that we can do this responsibly, that's all. And agree this is a priority, and we need to keep the momentum going.
Councilor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I am in full support of these motions. I'm very appreciative of the work that staff have done. Mr. Nielsen, I thought the report was excellent, and I'm also really appreciative of the folks that have dedicated their time to this process in the community, no matter what their role was, and also those that continually did that work in the absence of municipal leadership. I think Mr. Moss brought up a very good point last time that the outputs and the measurable outputs are probably going to be some of the most important things that, for me, that I'll be looking for in the strategy, and also hopefully tasking both our in-house and the agency with. I will note that the acronym NPA is taken, so we might have to reconsider that. And I think the most important output I'll be looking for, and I hope this will be reflected in us, some of our selections around the steering committee and also some of the work, the strategy is at the end of the day to address some of the systemic poverty in our community. And I think that's an important metric of success of any economic development function is, do we move that bar in any meaningful way? So thank you to all those that worked on this, and I'll be supporting these motions here and at council unless someone says something that convinces me to change my mind.
Thank you. Anybody else? So I'd like to also say thank you for the report. Well done. And staff as well. I think that we've thus far followed a really good process. And I think that it is important that we keep the momentum going. Also, I'd acknowledge too that I think a bit of trust was broken over the last couple of years with the implosion of the EDC, and I think a lot of the business community put a lot of effort in to support economic development, and I think it's really important for us to send a strong message that we are committed to having inclusion and really support groups taking ownership of our economic development process. And so I'd like to call the question. All those in favor? Very unanimous. So, next on the agenda, we have item E, agenda planning. Give a moment here as the room clears.
Mr. Chair, if I can speak to that. So in the last, I think it's page 78 and 77, we have the current calendar of GPC meetings. One opportunity that does exist is to add an additional one on September 30th. That's not on the calendar. In fact, it's a blank date on the Mondays in September. So I think I'd like to recommend that we book that, if we could, as a contingency date for an additional GPC in the fall. The only three items that staff are proposing that we have in terms of, actually there's only two now after today for future GPCs, is the rollout of the new OCP, Parks, Rec and Culture, and active transportation planning processes to be launched on September 9th. And that would be a full afternoon of clarity around those very important initiatives. That's the next scheduled activity. And then bringing back, which is a piece that we had originally scheduled earlier, is the procedure bylaw delegations, engagement, and a whole review of our governance excellence and that type of thing. The subsequent meeting, that could actually be moving ahead to September 30th, which would give time to add other topics. I know there's interest in things like bylaws and other topics that we could start to fill out these future meeting dates. So you may actually take time over the next little while to think about what you might want to put in there without the absence of an agenda planning committee. So we can build an agenda collectively. So I just want to say that is our itinerary at this time. And pleased to answer any questions.
Councillor Armstrong.
Thanks. Actually, you didn't mention it, Mr. Rudolph, is I would like to have an update on our bylaws. We have so many outstanding motions on bylaws that are supposed to have been changed. Like one that comes to mind, I got an email the other day on the rabbit bylaw. We're supposed to be a report come to council a year ago on the bylaws. So we have a lot of outstanding ones, so I'd like to know where we're at on those and all that. Thank you.
Councillor Bonner.
Hello?
It's like waving and.
Oh, no, I just scratched my face.
Bylaws coming soon.
So it's just an information item at this stage.
Councillor Clemens, did you have a comment? Okay. So to be clear, we're not looking to fill that slot.
Not today, no, this is actually a recurring item on your TPC, so that it's there and things come up or whatever, we'll just be clear what the schedule looks like. But one recommendation is that we do add September 3rd onto the list.
Okay.
So we're short a couple of GPCs simply because of Monday holidays, the UBCM and that type of thing.
So do we need a motion for that recommendation?
I don't know. We need a motion to add September 30th.
Yes, we should have an option.
Moved by Councillor Brown, seconded by Councillor Hemmons. All those in favor? Motion carried. Okay, so question period. Do you have any questions? It is empty.